Assalamu alaikum.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
How are you, Imam?
الحمد لله. Well, how are you, أخي?
I'm great, alhamdulillah. It's an honor to have you. So, let's start off with your book. You recently wrote a book, which is one of the reasons I thought of reaching out to you. It's called Sacred Activism, right? So, what does that mean? What does it mean to be involved in sacred activism, and what motivated you to write the book?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا دائما أبدا. So, in regards to the book Towards Sacred Activism, which my mentor, our Imam Zaid Shaka wrote the foreword, and Ustad Alina Safi, may Allah preserve them both. Ustad Alina Safi wrote the introduction. Towards Sacred Activism is kind of a response to what I see going on in the Muslim community right now in America, but even broadly in the West, in Canada, as well as in the UK. So it's a response to how I've seen a number of changes take place in the Muslim activism scene, in which I think that as there's been some improvement in certain things, I've seen a lot of erosion and some of the core values and principles from our faith being eroded from the activist scene, and people taking on more secular and even, I will say, leftist sensitivities, leftist leanings, and even leftist strategies that I believe kind of violate the prophetic model that was given to us and it was passed down by our pious predecessors. So that's kind of what sparked me to write the book. And actually, I'm old enough to remember the activist scene, or how I'm old enough to remember how MSA was, for instance, prior to 9/11. Like, I'm old enough to remember that as being a student in the 90s. So I've seen a radical departure, even how MSAs organize and what they talk about, some for the better and a lot of it for the worse, from my take. So, but it's um, not simply about focusing on people in that age or in college, but more so the broader activist scene, including people who are in my generation, so-called Generation X to millennials and below.
Yeah. I got it. So I speak to high school kids and college kids somewhat regularly, alhamdulillah. And obviously I learn a lot. I know it sounds cheesy, but I say that I learn more than I teach. But one of the things I notice, and I'm watching in terms of values and principles, in terms of strategies, in terms of just how they see the world, how they see college campuses, how they see their role. And of course, me, myself, still trying to figure out my role. But I noticed something. This is the analogy I use. And this is not the Muslim community in the US, but specifically the immigrant Muslim community, the Arabs and the Desis. We're like the new kids on the block, right? Or we're the new kids at school. It's like a new school. And so it's easy to get bullied because you're the new kid. And then you then kind of feel like you have to kind of, fit into one of the cliques really quickly because you want to fit into one of the groups because you're less likely to be bullied than being just the one kid on their own. And when we know this, but like Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and others who are trailblazers of the American Muslim community, I've already spoken about this decades ago and said we're not Republicans, we're not Democrats, just as an example.
Yes.
No, politics is bigger than that. But so would you agree to that? Like the idea that we feel like, oh, we have to be Democrats, and maybe our parents said we have to be Republican because we're closer to Muslims and Christians, and now we're like, oh, but they accept us. When both of those are wrong, would you agree to that? Like, it's wrong to put yourself in either box, and even if we're 1%, we got to be working on ourselves and trying to be that third alternative space. Is that a fair way to see it?
Okay, well, let me say this. Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah, may Allah preserve him, said that Malcolm X is the Imam Hussein of America.
Ooh,
and that's a very profound statement. And I think that it would be in the interests of the American Muslim community, in regards to studying history and historical context, to really do a deep study of the life of our Hussein America, Malcolm X, Imam Malcolm X, rahmatullahi alayh. And as you said accurately, that Malcolm X, he compared the so-called conservatives as wolves and the so-called liberals as foxes. And he said, but if you have a chicken coop, the wolf and the fox will both eat your chickens, right? So we are engaged in politics, and politics is the art of compromise, but it's the art of compromise as far as reaching your objective, but it's not compromising your morality. It's not saying I'm a conservative Muslim, nor am I a progressive Muslim, right? So this is part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that, Imam Malcolm X, he addressed this in a very balanced way, is that we can talk about injustice, we can talk about structural racism, as it's called in America. We can talk about racist policies that influence American foreign policy that devastate the global South, which the Muslim world is in that global South. We can talk about those at the same time, call ourselves to higher morality, to call ourselves to more ethical life, spirituality. So it's not an either or. That in order to be so-called woke, that you talk about the ills of white supremacy, how it plays itself out here and abroad, and at the same time absorb other people's morality. Within, in the name of so-called intersectionality, we begin to promote and even accept that which Allah and His Messenger not only forbade, but in some cases, certain things that Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam cursed, where His la'na was on things. So literally, we see people condemning white supremacy at the same time, celebrating or even trying to normalize and even worse, advance things that the la'na of Allah and His Messenger alayhi salam are upon. See, so that's highly problematic. So Malcolm gave us the balanced roadmap, and much of his critique about uh, uh, Black America and what we need to do, be as Muslim or not Muslim, is still valid. And I think for Muslims in general, much of his critique and giving us a way forward, I think that much of what he said for Muslims in general is still gives us a nice roadmap. Of course, there's tweaking. So I really challenge people to look at the totality of Malcolm and really ponder what Malcolm stood for, and we're not just talking about him being in the nation, but when him becoming a Sunni, like all that needs to be factored in.
I mean, the whole thing, right?
Yes, yes.
He's a human being. I know he went through phases. And what would you? So yeah, whether you're speaking to the adults or whether you're speaking to the youth, obviously I spent more time with the youth, but generally our community, I guess regardless of what country they come from, but especially if they come from like post-colonialism and so on, giving them an example of somebody who was assassinated at a young age, that's really tough. Saying like he was right, you got to read his books, and he was on point about this issue and that issue, and he saw it, although it was decades ago. No internet, no social media. You organized and mobilized, you had his priorities right, but then he got assassinated. It's really tough to sell people like you got to follow him because people are like, well, I don't want to be assassinated. So maybe Muhammad Ali is easier. It was easier to see Muhammad Ali because we all know, although he went through tough times, of course, and he had really tough challenges, and he almost went to prison in addition to losing his boxing license and his title, which I tell people are two different things, and that's really tough. But at least he lived till 74, and he had, he was accepted by the rest of the world, or at least a good chunk. What do you think? It's kind of tough to sell people an idea that you have to follow this guy who was assassinated. I mean,
Well, I think we should read both.
Suffer from like fear and paralysis.
Yeah, I think we should read both, but that paralysis that some people may have in terms of Malcolm, I think that this relates to what I talk about in the book, is that there has to be spirituality within the activism. And so if a person has an over attachment to dunya or hubbu dunya, then perhaps they shouldn't be involved in activism. Perhaps there needs to be some sort of tarbiyah. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive, but there has to be the spiritual work, because the reality of this dunya, it is fana, right? Or fani is a better word. It's going to be annihilated, and we're not promised longevity in this life. So, but success in this life is not longevity as far as years. And even if we live to be 80 years old, it's only a snap of a finger, right? It's basically nothing. The more important thing is that, do we live our lives holding upon our principles, right? So that's really what success. We leave the final outcomes to God, because we know the Quran says in several places, Inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir. He's the one who is in control of the qadr and has power over the outcomes. We don't have the ultimate control over outcomes, right? So Malcolm is a wonderful model. Muhammad Ali stood for justice as well, and he paid a price. But at the end of the day, it was through Allah's divine wisdom that that Muhammad Ali ended up being afflicted with Parkinson's disease, but he wasn't martyred because Muhammad Ali also faced many grave threats to his life and death threats. Right, it just wasn't Malcolm.
Sure.
Muhammad Ali faced a lot of threats too during his lifetime. So anytime we're involved in challenging injustice in the status quo, um, there's potential risk to reputation, to wealth, and sometimes even our personal safety. And that's just the reality that if anyone is going to be, and I'm not talking about uh, collectivism. I'm talking about really being involved and speaking on issues, organizing around issues, writing, walking the streets. If that's the type of activism someone's going to be involved in, it's not all glamorous, and people need to understand that.
Sounds good. So, I mean, connected to the topic of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and others like them, may Allah have mercy on them. Hopefully, we can, live a life that's like maybe 1/10 as meaningful. But I want to speak about the fact that it's the 400th year anniversary of Africans first being forced into slavery and brought to what is now the U.S. And we know that a fraction of them, I mean, maybe there's people debate the exact evidence, but something like a third or a fourth, a sizable fraction of those slaves or those who were forced into slavery were in fact Muslim. So at least 400 years. So blacks have been in the U.S. for at least 400 years, and at least because there are other theories as well, but this is like factual. I mean, that we know for a fact that they were brought here in 1619. And then at least 400 years, Muslims have been in the U.S. So I think that's really pertinent, especially because the immigrant Muslim community suffers with this idea that Trump isn't president and the political climate is rough. And is it okay? Are we American and Muslim? And some people still, unfortunately, still suffer with that. So I thought it was especially relevant to talk about this issue again to the audience of like Arabs and the people from the Indian subcontinent and those who are going through post-colonialism, connecting like slavery and post-slavery with colonialism and post-colonialism. And I got that from Malcolm X, right, saying that 400 years is long enough. So please enlighten us.
Okay, so I will make a couple of other points before the 1692.
Sure. No, sure,
they're very important. Number one, when the date 1619, when the date 1619 is meant, it's meant in part as the British being involved in the chattel slavery project in what's called the United States of America. But actually, Muslims have been here longer than Africans because of the Spanish. So we're talking about Florida and that area. So there were enslaved Africans in what is considered the United States of America prior to 1619.
Awesome. Okay.
So that's one thing. The second thing is that there is strong historical evidence that Muslims came to the Americas as free people before 1619, and this was written in Tarikh as-Sudan, which talks about the brother of Mansa Musa and the amount of ships that came over here. Ivan van Sertima wrote about this. He's not a Muslim anthropologist, wrote about this in a book called They Came Before Columbus. So we have strong historical data and support that can tell us that the first Muslims who came to the Americas actually came here as free individuals. Even before Columbus got lost, come over here in the year 1492. Because that's firstly when the colonialists first landed in the Caribbean, was in 1492, which was the same year, by the way, of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, as far as Americans, what is now the United States of America in the year 1692, and the enslaved Africans being brought to Jamestown. My grandfather, who turns 93 next month, God willing, lives very close to Jamestown, Virginia, where the first enslaved Africans were brought. And it is true that up to 30%, I think, is a more accurate, most accurate number of enslaved Africans who were brought here were Muslims, because we look at the lands in which the enslaved people came from. I mean, to this day, many of those lands are Muslim majority to this day. And there were no Christians in West Africa back in those days. It was colonialism and occupation of those lands. The British and the French brought Christianity to West Africa. There were no Christians in 1692 who were West Africans. Christianity is a very new issue, or a very new ideology in West Africa. historically. But I think this is important for American Muslims, because American Muslims, many people, and I would say more so from people who are first, second, third generation immigrant backgrounds. Um, I see many people, not all, but I see many people talking about America as if this isn't their land, or they have to try to prove to people, like we have to prove to the broader American society, predominantly white Americans, that, oh yeah, we're American just like you, instead of standing confidently and firmly and like, I don't have to prove anything to you. My, first of all, I'm a legal citizen, but second of all, my lineage as a religious group goes back in this land and has deeper roots than most of these other people who are trying to call us not American, right? So I think that there has to be some tweaking. And then also in our critique of American society, we can't decouple America's wealth and how America's a superpower with the issue of over 300 years, so about 300 years of free labor on stolen land, right? So when I hear people talking about America was built by immigrants, I think Muslims who are immigrants need to get out of this discourse. America was not built by immigrants. There were immigrants that came here and helped add to the fabric of the society, but the economic wealth of America, which made it a political power, built on the backs of African people, right? So people need to change this discourse, right? And even we hear African Americans who are running for elected office in the presidential election. You'll even hear some of these people, without mentioning names, they even quote this. And then they also say that, America is an exceptional country. So we have to get out of this American exceptionalism. Immigrants built this land, one, because it's not true. Number two, it does a disservice to how we're going to fix America and how to try to fix its structural problems when we are, as Muslims, parroting halfway false in a somewhat fictitious narrative of how America was really established and what are the structural implications of this 300 years of child slavery and almost another 100 years of legalized overt discrimination against Black people and Native Americans too. When we're talking about land grants, when we're talking about fair housing, we're talking about equal access to healthcare, education, all of this through Jim Crow, right? When interracial marriage wasn't even legalized in America fully until 1970 with the case of Loving versus Virginia. And there's a movie made about this, right? So for all intents and purposes, Black Americans have only had about 48 years of basically equal protection under the law in the United States of America overtly. Now, it still hasn't been an actual practice of the enforcement of laws, right? And we can see this with the issue of mass incarceration, right? With selective prosecution, over policing of certain communities, giving certain people probation, or they need treatment while other people who do the same crimes go to prison and spend long prison terms. So we as a Muslim community, especially those who are non-Black, and by non-Black, I'm speaking non-African American, because even immigrants from Africa even sometimes play into this type of this same type of discourse, right? So we need to fix our language and fix our discourse relating to 1619.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, what is the phrase? What did you use? Immigrants built this country.
Yes.
Yeah. A more accurate statement would be that immigrants have contributed to the U.S. for hundreds of years or something, right?
Yeah,
they're trying to fight against the wall, or they're trying to fight against like immigration policy that makes it sound like immigrants are all criminals and that they're here to ruin things. And they're trying to say, well, that's not fair, because how many different groups have come around the world and they all had their place. But saying they built the country is implying that they're the very foundation, and they're not. The foundation was slavery. Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. I appreciate it. What's your advice to young Muslims?
My advice to young Muslims that there are two very important keys in terms of sacred activism, or even if you're not going to be involved in activism. The first of that is your suhbah, or your companionship, will make you or break you. And it is not as important to be accepted as the in crowd or to be cool. To preserve yourself and inshallah, God willing, to help you in success in the years to come, you need to keep suhbah with righteous people, people who are remembering Allah and His Messenger, alayhi salatu salam, and are not involved in issues that are not only forbidden, but also are reprehensible, right? So this suhbah is keeping good company in person. I'm not talking about simply social media, who you follow and who you don't follow, or who's on your WhatsApp or your Snapchat. Many of these types of relationships, in fact, have a level of superficiality about it, right? And most people who are your Facebook friends aren't really your friends. You're not going to keep an amana. They don't have your best interests at heart, right? Sorry to break it to you, but they're not. So for those young people who are watching, it's simply not reality. So suhbah, who you're keeping companionship, is good. The second thing is we have to learn our deen. All of us as Muslims, we are obligated to learn our deen. So take time to learn your deen, and learn your deen from qualified teachers. And I don't mean just watching a YouTube clip here or there or listen to a podcast. To sit with someone who is a teacher and learn the foundational beliefs of Islam, like starting with the Aqidah, or the creed of Islam. And that starts with Tawheed. This is perhaps the most important thing. Also, learning from a teacher and or having a spiritual mentor, there's other things that can be learned besides issues of like learning creed intellectually, right? It's also learning adab, or proper comportment with one's elders, right? So Islam, and we can look at the Quran and also the history of our Prophet alayhi salam and the companions, that we do have certain types of hierarchies of where certain people are deserving of more deference than others, right? So, and like your peer or your homie, you don't have the same comportment with that person as your parent, or you shouldn't, or your sheikh or your sheikha or ustada, the female scholar, right? So we also have to learn proper comportment and proper adab, and having spiritual mentorship, having a teacher will help in this issue of adab, because one of the things that really saddens me the most is the erosion of adab in so-called woke culture, right? Like, for instance, this one sheikh who's been involved in an online controversy from a video. He's in his 60s. He's old enough to be some younger people's grandfathers, and they're like referring to him by his first name, or they're not calling him sheikh. At the least, he should be brother if you don't recognize him as being a sheikh. But like, you don't refer to someone who's a scholar, or even if he wasn't a scholar, someone who's as old as your father or grandfather, you don't call them by their first name. And it's disrespectful, even if you disagree with what they say. So that's just like one small example of like the adab that need to be learned by dealing with a spiritual mentor or having a teacher.
Imam Dawud, may Allah reward you for your time. Really appreciate it. It was an honor. Maybe we can do this again sometime, inshallah. But
Inshallah.
Thank you so much for your time. May Allah reward you. Jazakumullah khair.
Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.